PhD through the University of Hong Kong. I'm now back in Melbourne, so I'm on Australia time with most of you. I will just share my screen now, hopefully successfully. We had a bit of a practice run before. Let me know if it doesn't work. Is that all right for everyone? Yes, I can see some nods.
Yep, looks good.
And I'll time myself as well so that I can try and stay as close to the time as possible. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am presenting today on Aboriginal land and to acknowledge Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, as well as recognising any First Nations people who are attending my presentation today. I don't think my screen's not going to the next slide. Oh, no, there we go. All right, let's go. It is Valentine's Day 2017 and I'm in Frankston, a suburb which sits at the far outskirts of Melbourne's southeast. Although it falls within Melbourne's sprawling metropolis, Frankston feels so very detached from the city centre. It is, after all, known as the gateway to the Mornington Peninsula. As the train rattles towards my destination, I feel my distance from the city growing, stretching like a rubber band as I leave behind the skyscrapers for this suburb by the sea. I meet Rosie at the train station and she takes me to her home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a neat brick 2-bedroom unit nestled in a court and hidden from view by a collection of bushes. This, I will think later to myself, is the perfect location for a woman from England who has escaped a brutally violent marriage with an Australian man. This is the perfect location in which a woman and her young child can disappear from view. Sharing a simple antipasto spread, Rosie tells me of her separation after migrating to Melbourne in 2002 with a spouse visa. Like many of the stories of separation I have collected thus far, Rosie's divorce talk, to adopt Reisman's term, is presented in fragments, a collection of memories, feelings, and reflections which she weaves together into a rich, complex tapestry of love and loss. She shares these snippets with me in bursts, straddling the doorway which leads into her courtyard. In her right hand, she holds a cigarette. She leans out of the doorway, inhales, sinking deeply into moments of thought, and then she exhales before ducking her head back in to share another aspect of her life, which constitutes what Kwa would call a divorce biography. As I sit at Rosie's dining room table, recording her story, her little dog resides at my feet, and I pat his head. When I get distracted with my note-taking, a paw makes its way gingerly back up to my knee and taps it gently, a reminder to keep up with my patting duties. Nearby, 2 of Rosie's 3 cats sit on guard atop her couches, quietly observing us deep in conversation. I write and pat. Rosie talks, inhales and exhales. Later, we crunch on crackers and carrot sticks. And just out of reach sit her cats, radiating a powerful stillness over the scene, stirring only occasionally to stretch before resuming their positions. Together, all of this will become the rhythm of Rosie's interview. On the train ride home, I will look down to see a couple of dusty paw marks on the right knee of my black jeans, a reminder of the strong impression I have gained that these animals are not just part of Rosie's post-divorce family life, but essential to it. Yet, just as those dusty paw marks will fade in the wash, so too will that little dog who loves pats and those quiet cats disappear from my research findings. They will disappear from my findings and subsequently will not make their way into my final thesis. It will only be later that I will realise how anthropocentric my chapters are, and it is only now that I am, in the words of Charles, stepping across the species barrier. It is only now that I am, in reference to this conference theme, engaging with the multi-species entanglements of migrant women's post-divorce family lives. Between 2016 and 2017, I interviewed 46 women like Rosie, women who had migrated under a spouse visa scheme but subsequently divorced. 21 of these women were living in Melbourne like Rosie, and the remaining 25 in Hong Kong, where I was undertaking my PhD. Although these women were connected by the relationship-based legal status which they migrated under, as well as by their experiences of divorce overseas, they were, as a group, otherwise diverse. 21 different nationalities, various class statuses, diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, a wide array of occupations, a range of educational levels, and a number of religious and spiritual followings. The way in which these women differ from one another is what allowed me to be able to pinpoint the role of their commonality, this being their spouse visa status, in their family practices. On the whole, I discovered that the spouse visa shapes the family practices of migrant women, leading them to be affected by and often internally adopt what I have come to call the migrant wife positionality. This happens in both cities. It happens to all of the women, although to varying degrees and in different ways. And the migrant wife positionality has an enduring effect. It is entrenched during their arrival and settlement. It continues during the collapse of their marriages. And perhaps most surprisingly, it lingers post-divorce. In helping me to frame my research findings, I dive deep into the sociology of personal life literature, and it is through this process that Rosie's little dog and her cats and the other non-humans in the lives of my informants fade from view. I read the work of personal life sociologists who have really extended understandings of family life beyond the nuclear, heterosexual, immediate family, which has historically dominated research, policy, and practice. I am inspired by their work, and my thinking about family broadens. But later, I will discover it still has limitations. In my final chapter, where I consider the women's post-divorce family lives, I write of lovers and partners, old and new, of blended family structures, of families which cross borders, described as transnational, of the vital role friends play and how these relationships can become kin-like, and in the Hong Kong context, of the way in which the women see their domestic workers as not just employees, but members of their family. The non-humans in these women's lives I do not mention, and this is a glaring and highly problematic omission. This will become, for me, what Shapiro and DeMello call the question of the animal, essentially why we think about animals the way we do, and in my case, why we sometimes fail to think about them at all. I will begin to wonder why animals did not feature in my writing when they so clearly featured in the post-divorce lives of a number of my participants. I will come to realise that it was because the sociological literature on personal and family life prioritises the relations of humans that led me to do the same, falling into the trap of speciesism that so many mainstream sociologists are prone to. As a result of these reflections, I decide to return to my data with new eyes and a new intention. This is, I must admit, still a work in progress. I need to go further into my data and extend my knowledge of animal studies literature before I can come to any firm conclusions. But tentatively, these are the results of my re-examinations thus far. Not all of the women had divorce biographies in which non-humans feature. Out of my 46 interviewees, 6 in Melbourne and 8 in Hong Kong spoke of non-human beings in their descriptions of their family lives. For the most part, these women discussed the role of other species in their family lives after divorce. Although animals and other non-humans held significance during my informants' marriages, it was after they left their husbands that these species became much more prominent as members in their family structures. We must remember here that not only have these women lost their husbands, but they are also migrants, meaning that many live apart from their extended family and their closest friends. Life after separation is a lonely place to be, but for migrant women, it is doubly so. With this in mind, it is unsurprising that Fox and Walsh find that companion animals provide a sense of home and belonging for migrants, a finding further elaborated upon in a recent article by Machete Mercer, who argues that these human-non-human relations have a stabilising effect for migrants, especially during experiences of disruption. My interviewees revealed to me that the non-human animals in their lives positively influence the energy of their family homes. They act as either a calming influence, as described by Amy, a woman from the US based in Melbourne, or as a re-energising force, as in the case of Beyonce, an American woman living in Hong Kong. Beyonce tells me that I got another dog because it was like, I want this house to be crazy and happy and silly. Non-human animals can brighten post-divorce family life, but in different circumstances, they can also exacerbate the disruption of a migrant woman's life, deepening her sense of isolation and heightening the sadness she feels. I am brought to tears by the story of Helen, a UK woman in Melbourne whose housing instability meant she was unable to keep her 2 dogs. Faced with the heartbreaking choice of housing herself and her daughter or retaining her role as the dog's primary carer, Helen is forced to leave these animals under the guardianship of her ex-husband. And it is her ex-husband who eventually decides to put them up for readoption. He said, "We are doing it tomorrow. We are taking them to the RSPCA." And I didn't want them to go there because I knew that they would probably be put down. But I knew they couldn't stay with me, and I knew he wouldn't have them. I just broke down. Everything over the last few years came out, and I think I cried for hours and hours. And he would just walk around me. He was very cold. It was the lowest I have ever gone in my whole life at that point, and I said, the only way is up now. Start from the beginning. As Helen's marriage collapses, she simultaneously loses her dogs, which she describes to me as being her first 2 children. This is not only the story of a marital breakup, but a family one, where she has lost the right to care for her dependents. Tangled up in Helen's experience is her continuing powerlessness in determining how her family life operates. It is her husband's decision that the dogs will be put up for adoption, and she is unable to challenge this because of her own weak financial standing. It is her own hardship, which importantly is linked to her position as a migrant wife, which has led to her inability to access housing that she needs in order to keep her companion animals. It is interesting that while the women's stories of human and non-human entanglements differ, they are still connected. All touch on the way in which the women were previously disempowered in their marriages due to the spouse visa status, which situated them as sponsored by their husbands and created a particularly uneven marital power dynamic. After sharing with me the joy that her second dog brings to her family life, Beyonce explains that she adopted him because she could. She then draws an unexpected link between her husband's refusal of her need to purchase a new kitchen mixer with his denial of her desire to add an additional dog to the family unit. For Beyonce, the second dog is reflective of her new decision-making power, but he also acts as a poignant reminder of her former powerlessness and the way in which it both inhibited her life and undermined her independence. Danuta from Poland, also living in Hong Kong, makes a similar comment when she explains that after separation, she bought a dog for the kids because her ex-husband had previously forbade her from doing so. In returning to my data, I wonder whether these animals have been introduced in order to entertain or to comfort the women and or their children, or whether they act as substitutes for missing family members, namely the women's husbands. Valid questions can be asked about whether they fill an emotional gap, perhaps acting as an antidote for the loneliness that divorce overseas inevitably brings. I consider how important the animal actually is in all of this, and whether its introduction into the women's family lives is just another way for the women to take a stand against their husbands, who have long commanded over the family, and with it the women themselves. But these thoughts once again remind me of the importance of the women's entry by spouse visa and the migrant wife positionality it encourages them to perform, and how this legal status fundamentally shapes the way in which they live their lives, not only during their marriages, but after. In other depictions, the women see their animals as fundamental participants in the family structure, whose needs are considered alongside the women's own and their children. Even now, Anastasia from the UK, living in Hong Kong, continues to send me photos of her rescue dogs frolicking in the sun as she walks along the beach. And I think too of Anissa, a woman from Indonesia based in Melbourne, who tells the story of her 3 cats, all of whose lives were threatened by the neglect and mistreatment of humans, and how this mirrors Anissa's own victimisation and her own risk of homelessness that she experienced after she fled her violent Australian ex-husband. And then, of course, there is Rosie with her little dog and her cats. And there is Ella, an Australian woman living in Hong Kong who sees her dog as her advisor, using his body language to guide her judgment of the character of the new people she encounters. Just because some of the women may, at the start, introduce the animals into their home for comfort, for entertainment, or even to make a stand against their husbands, does not mean these animals are not loved, and nor does it mean that they do not hold a central place within the post-divorce family structure. In fact, the situation is much more complex. So it is here where I need to take a pause to carefully unpack such a problem in a way that on the one hand respectfully acknowledges the histories of the women, and on the other hand considers the quality of life of their animals. This process takes time, and I am still unravelling the many layers required. What I am looking at here is relations, not only between the non-human and human, but also between human and human, specifically between a husband and wife, and also between a husband who has sponsored his wife and a wife who was marginalised by this legal arrangement. And so the decisions the women make after their divorce in terms of their companion animals must be understood in this context. I wish I had the answers to share with you today, but I am instead sharing with you a midpoint in my journey with this reanalysis of my work. And it is my hope that by listening to you all during the conference, that I will be able to take the next steps in this process in a way that brings the women's animals much more fully into my picture of their family lives after divorce. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was a fabulous paper. And could you possibly just stop sharing your screen now, if that's okay? Or actually, if people want to just take down your details, sure that people can get that separately.
You probably get that in the email, can't they?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then if people could just, who want to ask questions, use the raise hand function so I can see it. I'm sure there'll be some questions there for you. You go to participants at the bottom and then you just put up raise hand and I should be able to see any that come up there. If there's not any coming through so far, I will take this opportunity as the chair to ask a question if there's not any coming through. Okay, well, I'll just ask a question. I really enjoyed your paper. I thought it was fantastic, and your research sounds really important and interesting. The question I had would be, it seems like you've had this really interesting epiphany moment in the research where it started off as being very human-centric, and it's evolved into this kind of much more multi-species inclusive kind of assemblage. And I just wonder, would you have done the research differently with that kind of insight from how you've done it? I mean, yeah, I'm just kind of curious as to that kind of methodological development, and if so, yeah, how, and if not, why not? So that's kind of my question.
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because even though I'm now coming back to the data with a new lens, I still asked particular questions during the interview. I still observed particular things. I didn't ask questions about the women's animals. I mean, one element to mention here is that I used problem-centered interviewing, which some people might know of. It's usually used in more so by German-speaking scholars, but it's an interviewing style which allows the women to basically tell their divorce story in full without me interfering very much. And then I ask sort of for clarity later on, and I might probe a little bit more. But I do give them a lot of control over that divorce story, because they often, for anyone who's separated, they've already really drafted the story in their mind, so they don't want to have lots of questions. They actually want to tell you from start to finish. So when animals did come up in that story, I actually have that data. But because I hadn't sort of thought about it being a question to ask, there are a lot of women who I don't know if they actually did have companion animals, if that was important, or if they had companion animals who perhaps they didn't consider as part of family, who were just sort of, considered as pets. So it does mean that although I'm able to reanalyze my data, it does create some limitations around my findings. And so, yes, to answer your question, if I could go back in time, I would really approach it differently. With Rosie, for example, I only know about how central those animals are because I actually went to her home. She doesn't talk about it, but I was there, I experienced it, I saw how she engaged with them. So I think, as the first speaker spoke about, actually being able to go and be in the home of these women, if they're happy for that to happen, would actually have given me a really different insight too. So if I did this research again, yes, methodologically, I would approach it differently to make sure that I really considered companion animals more centrally.
Thank you. That's great. Now, sadly, we just have to keep moving.
It's totally fine.
Yeah,